What if much of what you were told about patriarchy wasn't merely incomplete, but strategically framed? Not because a cabal of feminists gathered in a room to lie to you. That story is too clean, too comforting. The real reason is simpler and more disturbing. Certain explanations survive not because they are most accurate, but because they are easiest to circulate, easiest to defend, and most profitable, socially, professionally, reputationally. They reward the right people. They flatter the right identities. They offer villains where complexity would demand responsibility. And once a story does that, it doesn't need to be true. It only needs to be useful. This matters, because narratives don't just describe the world. They decide which questions are permitted, which explanations are taboo, and which conclusions are punished before they're even spoken. The first step toward understanding history is not endorsement. It is not rebellion. It is the willingness to look at what worked before asking whether it was just. History does not care about morality. It does not care about ethics. It does not care what should have happened. It records outcomes. It records survival. It records what endured long enough to shape the present. This way of looking at the past makes people uncomfortable for a reason. It removes heroes. It removes villains. And most threatening of all, it removes the comforting belief that suffering must have come from malice. Nature offers no moral relief. It offers explanation. And explanation is dangerous when someone's identity depends on blame. For more than 200,000 years, over 95% of human existence, humans lived as hunter-gatherers. No cities, no courts, no police, no written law. Survival was immediate. Protection was physical. Violence was not a failure of the system. It was the system. This is the environment patriarchy emerged from. Not ideology, not agenda, not conspiracy, environment. And in that environment, certain asymmetries mattered, whether anyone liked them or not. Before civilization, power did not emerge from ideas. It emerged from bodies. Men were, on average, larger and stronger. That difference mattered, constantly. Not in theory, in contact. Early hunting was not clean or distant. There were no rifles, no safety margins, no second chances. Stone-tipped spears lacked stopping power. Wounded animals did not flee. They charged. A missed thrust meant crushed ribs, torn flesh, certain death. Those who could close distance, drive force, hold ground, and finish the kill fed their groups. Those who could not disappeared from the lineage. Strength selected itself. Intergroup conflict followed the same logic. There were no borders to appeal to, no courts to mediate, no deterrence beyond retaliation. Territory was taken or lost by force. Food was defended physically. Access to mates was contested violently. Raids were not moral failures. They were tactics. Ambushes were not atrocities. They were efficient. Men who were stronger were more likely to survive conflict, more likely to deter attack, and more likely to protect kin long enough for children to reach maturity. Women, meanwhile, carried a different cost. Pregnancy, childbirth, and prolonged child-rearing imposed constraints that could not be ignored without risking extinction. A pregnant woman could not flee quickly. A nursing mother could not fight effectively. A society that exposed its reproductive core to constant danger did not last. So roles differentiated. Not by vote, not by philosophy, by pressure. Male dominance was not declared. It was basic survival math. It emerged as a side effect of survival. Not conspiracy, not ideology, not a coordinated project. An outcome. Before asking whether any system was just, there is a prior question most people avoid. Why did it work? Because systems in nature do not arise from nuance. They arise from efficiency, from ease, from friction reduction. Nature does not optimize for dignity. It optimizes for continuity. Simply put, nature takes the path of least resistance. And size, uncomfortable as it is to admit, was one of the most reliable predictors of who ended up in control. Not because size is good, but because size works. This pattern is not uniquely human. Across species, dominance hierarchies track physical dimorphism with brutal consistency. Where males are larger, hierarchies skew male. Where females are larger, the structure often reverses. Not because of values, not because of culture. Because mass, strength, and leverage decide outcomes long before morality is invented. Nobody calls this oppression when it happens outside our species. No one campaigns for the smaller male mantis when his head is eaten. No one writes manifestos for the weaker hyena who eats last. No one moralizes the lioness's authority or the gorilla's dominance. These outcomes are not praised. They are not condemned. They are described and then accepted. But when humans display patterns that resemble the rest of the living world, the language suddenly changes. Now it's sin. Now it's injustice. Now it's a unique moral crime that must be explained by malice rather than mechanics. So here is the question most people avoid. Not because it's complex, but because it's destabilizing. Why is it called nature when animals follow power, but evil when humans do? Are humans exempt from biology? Or only when biology becomes inconvenient? If you believe humans are part of nature, then patterns require explanation before judgment. And if you believe humans are somehow above nature, then you owe an account of when that exemption began and why it applies selectively. Why do we accept dominance patterns as natural in animals, but moralize them as evil in humans? Most people never answer this question. They just switch vocabularies. The same behavior that is accepted as domination in animals becomes frowned upon as oppression in humans. Not because the structure changed, but because the story did. This is not an argument that humans should copy animal behavior, nor a claim that what once existed should be recreated or defended today. It is simply an argument against selective outrage, because moral language is often not applied where harm is greatest, but where guilt is most useful. Now, here is another truth people prefer not to touch. Violence, or the threat of it, is not a moral failure of nature. It is the cheapest enforcement mechanism available in a world without abstraction. When there are no laws, no contracts, no courts, and no shared symbols strong enough to compel obedience, force does the job. Not because it is noble, but because it works. Rules do not exist on their own. They require enforcement. In environments without institutions, enforcement defaults to bodies. Strength, numbers. Reputation for retaliation. This is not pathology. It is logistics. Force is what remains when nothing else is available. Judging this reality from the comfort of modern systems is easy, but it is also dishonest. Because law did not replace violence. It absorbed it. Every court ruling carries an implied threat. Every contract is backed by enforcement. Every peaceful system rests on the promise that someone, somewhere, will apply force if it is violated. Modern society did not eliminate violence. It centralized it, outsourced it, sanitized it. And because that violence is now distant, uniformed, procedural, bureaucratic, it becomes easy to forget what it replaced. So when people look backward and condemn ancient structures as barbaric, they are not displaying moral clarity. They are displaying historical amnesia. They are judging systems formed under direct survival pressure. using standards that only exist because those pressures were already solved. Understanding this does not sanctify the past. It dissolves fantasy. Judging systems without understanding the constraints that produce them is not ethics. It is mere theater. Even now, these patterns do not vanish evenly. In regions where institutions are vague, where law is unreliable, enforcement is personal, and survival still runs through family networks, hierarchies anchored in physical dominance tend to persist. Not because the people are less intelligent, not because they are morally inferior, but because the environment still rewards those structures. This has nothing to do with virtue. It has everything to do with incentives. Where survival remains physical, power remains bodily. Where enforcement is local, dominance remains personal. As institutions deepen, something fundamental changes. Violence is outsourced to the state. Protection becomes procedural. Agreements are enforced through contracts rather than intimidation. Power migrates from muscle to abstraction. Bodies matter less. Processes matter more. And as that shift accelerates, the biological asymmetries that once structured power lose their advantage. But here is the part most people miss. Biology does not update on political timelines. Systems can be redesigned in decades. Instincts adapt over millennia. The environment changes fast. The wiring does not. Behaviors once rewarded are now constrained. Impulses once necessary are now punished. Roles once efficient are now obsolete. The result is tension. Between bodies shaped for direct force and systems that prohibit it. Between instincts forged under scarcity and environments built on abundance. Between ancient survival logic and modern moral language. This is where contemporary society actually lives. And this is where feminism entered the picture. Not as rebellion, not as moral correction, not as a retroactive verdict on history, but as adaptation. That distinction matters, because feminism didn't emerge when humanity finally woke up. It emerged when the environment changed, when survival was no longer settled in contact. The past didn't become immoral. It became inefficient. Once survival stopped running through brute force, excluding half the population stopped making sense. Modern systems began rewarding cognition, not mass. And in those systems, physical dimorphism began to matter less. This is not a claim that men and women are identical. But at the level modern systems operate, the gap in cognitive capacity is negligible close enough that exclusion stops filtering incompetence and starts filtering opportunity. Intelligence didn't suddenly appear in women. It was already there. What changed was feedback. Competence could finally produce results without bodily risk. Planning, learning, coordination became leverage. And once those traits paid off, it became more efficient to have women working alongside men. Women noticed. Not because of ideology, because incentives changed. This wasn't a moral awakening. It was an efficiency upgrade. But when adaptation is mistaken for moral awakening, something dangerous happens. A functional response hardens into sacred truth. A context-bound solution freezes into doctrine, and doctrine doesn't adapt. It enforces. This is where the fracture begins. When tools turn into identities. When responses to incentives become universal moral verdicts. When history stops being studied for constraints and starts being prosecuted for guilt. It's an attempt to mythologize the present. But here's the thing. If power structures follow incentives and morality follows power structures, then no justice is eternal. It's conditional. A moving equilibrium. And pretending otherwise doesn't make society fairer. It makes it brittle. In the series that follows, this moves out of male power tools, violence, dominance, enforcement, and into female adaptive behavior. Out of ideology, into responsibility. We'll look at what female power actually looks like, how it operates in modern systems, where it stabilizes and where it becomes dangerous, what reduces resentment instead of amplifying it, what aligns freedom with consequence instead of entitlement, and finally, an olive branch, not backward, forward, a framework to call forth the Uberfemme, not as a moral ideal, not as opposition, not as retreat, but as a behavioral perspective compatible with modern conditions, built for cooperation without weakness, strength without resentment, freedom without collapse. And if that unsettles you, good. That means you're still thinking. If you disagree, explain where the structure breaks. Not how it made you feel, but which incentive I misread, which mechanism doesn't hold, which pressure I ignored. Comment with specifics. Like the video if you want explanations instead of outrage. Subscribe if you're tired of being told what to think and want help understanding why things work at all.